The Challenge of Bergsonism by Leonard Lawler. Phenomenology, Ontology, Ethics. Preface. Memory and Life. Bergson himself states the challenge that his philosophy represents when he says, quote, "Questions related to subject and object, to their distinction and to their union, should be put in terms of time rather than space." To put questions relating to subject and object in terms of time means that we must think in terms of duration. While Bergson defines duration in many ways, most basically, this book concerns itself with the concept of duration. It can be summarized in the following formula. Duration equals memory plus the absolutely new. Giving the primary role to memory, this formula implies that Bergsonism is a primacy of memory and not a primacy of perception. And this is why Bergsonism is, first, a challenge to phenomenology. In the phenomenology of perception, Merleau-Ponty says, to perceive is not to remember. Though this distinction between perception and remembering, Merleau-Ponty intends to prioritize perception over memory. For him, there is no call from the present to memory without the immanent sense that perception makes available. In contrast, in Matter and Memory, Bergson says, to imagine is not to remember. Through this distinction, Bergson intends to prioritize memory over any form of imagining, including perception, for him, while perception calls for memory. Perception does not make sense without memory. In fact, for Bergson, the priority of memory is so extreme that we must say that being is memory. Even though the concept of the image in Matter and Memory looks to be a new, non-phenomenological concept of presence, presence becomes, in Bergson, derivative from memory. This identification of being and memory is why, second, the challenge of Bergsonism is a challenge to ontology. Of course, in the most famous footnote in Being and Time, Heidegger criticizes Bergson's concept of time as duration for having merely reversed Aristotle's numerical definition of time. Indeed, Bergson's relentless denunciation of analysis that divide things according to number or according to quantitative differences, I look to be a reversal in favor of quality. It is possible to see in Bergson's concept of memory a reversal of Platonism. Yet, Bergson, to use Heidegger's phrase, twists free of Platonism. He twists free because memory in Bergson is ontological. It gives us a new sense of being. Being in terms of the past, not in terms of the present. Being as the unconscious instead of consciousness. In order to understand the connection between memory and being in Bergson, I relied heavily on Jean Hyppolite's Aspects diverses de la mémoire chez Bergson. This is why I have included an English translation of it in Appendix 2. This new sense of being means that Bergson is not merely replacing objectivism with a kind of subjectivism. But there's more. Because Bergson compares his image of the memory cone to a telescope, we can see that he has replaced the Platonic sun, the good, with the Milky Way, with stars and planets. This means that what memory recalls are multiplicities and singularities, not identities and universals. It is clear that Bergson at least reverses Platonism, since he constantly criticizes Zeno's alleged paradoxes. He does not subscribe to the Eleatic philosophy of the same. Moreover, Bergson's emphasis of the absolute new means that his thought is not totalizing. In fact, the slogan for this book could be that the whole is not given. In his later writings, of course, Levinas acknowledges the importance of Bergson's philosophy for ethics in the sense of a discourse of alterity. But Levinas also wonders whether the Bergsonian experience of duration, what Bergson calls intuition, really gets the alterity of the new. Explode, articulate and untouchable as alterity or absolute newness, the absolute itself in the etymological sense of the term. Levinas can say this because he believes that Bergsonian intuition is a form of representation. But this failure in Bergsonism for Levinas may be what is most important about it. It leads us away from the discourse of intersubjectivity and the logic of alterity. When Bergson criticizes the Eleatic tradition, he is, in effect, criticizing the entire logic of the same and other. He does this in what we could call a philosophy of language. Through the concept of the dynamic schema, Bergson furnishes us with a new concept of sense, a new concept of the concept, in which there is no alterity, but instead of representation, there is alteration, variation, movement, and therefore life. These three challenges to phenomenology, to ontology, to ethics came about on the basis of a reading of Bergson's Matter and Memory. The 3 chapters in the present volume correspond to those 3 challenges. Chapter 3, however, ends by taking up the idea of creative emotion from Bergson's 2 sources of morality and religion. Appendix 1 expands the investigation of the 2 sources by attempting to think about Bergson's ethics as such, and not in relation to his so-called philosophy of language. Between the completion of the 3rd chapter and the writing of the 1st appendix, I started to wonder about the resources available in contemporary philosophy for ethical thinking, resources other than Scheler, other than Levinas, other than Heidegger, other than Sartre and Beauvoir. I also started to wonder about the possibility of an ethical thinking that is distinctly continental, in contrast to analytic philosophy's moral theory. But it's clear that when I started to wonder about ethics, I had fallen into the line called forth by the very noisy drumbeat of philosophy today. Ethics and politics, ethics and politics. In contemporary philosophy, it is hard not to be swept up into trends. It is hard to be genuinely untimely. But I hope the reader can recognize that by linking Matter and Memory with the 2 sources, 2 books, by the way, that Bergson himself did not directly link. He intended the 2 sources as a continuation of creative evolution. I'm trying to link some now apparently uninteresting metaphysical ideas, like reversing Platonism, with some new, apparently interesting ethical ideas about absolute justice. In this book, I am trying to follow my own line. Nevertheless, as Bergson would say, there is always aspiration along with pressure. So one should note that the title of this preface is an allusion to a small book by Gilles Deleuze, Mémoire et Vie. Deleuze, of course, defined Bergson's philosophy with the phrase memory and life. But it also makes one think, thanks again to Deleuze, of Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morals. When I started then to investigate the 2 sources, I was looking for similarities with Nietzsche. After all, the 2 sources is the only published book of Bergson's in which Bergson mentions Nietzsche by name. With Nietzsche in mind, It turned out that the two sources is engaged in a project that cannot be characterized as moral theory. Instead, Bergson is engaged in an archaeology of originary experience. This experience is what Bergson calls mystical experience. It is the experience of the reciprocal implication of images and emotions. In fact, it is not even clear that we can call what he is doing in the two sources an ethics in the standard sense, since he says that this experience is more metaphysical than moral. If it presents anything, the two sources presents an originary ethics. But besides an archaeology, Bergson is engaging in genealogy. He thinks that mystical experience and its asceticism will transform the genus humanity into a divine humanity, into one might say, a superhumanity. As archaeology and genealogy suggest, the most striking similarity between Bergson and Nietzsche is the concern with memory. Again, as I said above, I have tried to show that Bergson's ethics, his originary ethics, maintains a deep connection with the concept of memory developed in matter of memory. Mystical experience in Bergson is an experience of memory. Consequently, following the image he gives us in matter of memory, the memory cone is a kind of telescope. We must say that Bergson's ethics is really an astronomy. This astronomy, looking heavenward, indicates a fundamental difference between Bergson and Nietzsche, a difference that perhaps overturns the results of chapter 3. The two sources privileges a religious experience, and Bergson explicitly mentions the ascetic ideal over philosophy. On the genealogy of morals, privileges we knowers, that is, the philosophers who question even the value of truth, over the ascetic ideal. Perhaps, in the final analysis, we have to characterize Bergson as a philosopher of transcendence rather than as a philosopher of immanence. On the basis of this investigation, I am more certain than ever that, today, we must rethink precisely the relation between immanence and transcendence. In any case, because Deleuze focused primarily on matter and memory, Deleuze says that matter and memory contains the secret of Bergsonism. He classified Bergsonism as an immanentist. Indeed, Deleuze and Guattari in What is Philosophy say, quote, "Will we ever be mature enough for Spinozist inspiration of immanence? It happens once with Bergson. The beginning of matter and memory marks out a plane that slices through the chaos, both the infinite movement of a matter that continually propagates itself and the image of a thought that everywhere spreads an in principle pure consciousness. Immanence is not immanent to consciousness, but the other way around." End quote. Because matter and memory lays out a strict plane of immanence, it confronts the problem of metaphysical dualism. Subtitle of the original French edition of Matter and Memory, there is no subtitle in the English edition, translates as an essay on the relation of the body to the mind or spirit, and immediately makes one think of an essay on the immediate data of consciousness, the title of Bergson's first book. Time and Free Will is the title of the English translation. This association to the essay is supposed to indicate that progress made over the 7 years, 1889 to 1896, between the two publications. The essay constructed a dualism between time and space, between spirit and matter. As I have already stated, Bergson always denounces thinking in terms of differences of degree. The conclusion of the essay is that the difference between spirit and matter is a difference in nature. So, like the essay Matter and Memory, is, as Bergson says explicitly in the preface of the 1910 edition, clearly dualist. But unlike the essay, Matter and Memory asserts the reality of spirit and the reality of matter. It is not the case that matter is some sort of illusion, rather, matter is real. The dualism of reality allows us then, according to Bergson, to attenuate, if not suppress, the theoretical difficulties which the dualism suggested by immediate consciousness and adopted by common sense as always raised. Therefore, the purpose of Matter and Memory lies in showing that both consciousness, conscience in French, conscience, and science are right, that science and conscience fundamentally agree, provided that we regard consciousness in its immediate data and science in its remote aspiration. Thus, Matter and Memory is supposed to bring us to a new monism, the plane of immanence. In Matter and Memory, 4th chapter, Bergson himself says that his philosophical method of intuition, which had been used in relation to the problems of consciousness in the essay, is now being applied to matter. He says, quote, "The question is whether the confused mass which tends towards extension could be seized by us on the nearer side of the homogeneous space to which it is applied and through which we subdivide it, just as that part which goes to make up the inner life can be detached from time, empty and indefinite, and brought back to pure duration." End quote. Commenting on this discussion, Victor Delbos noted in his 1897 review that Matter and Memory allows us to, quote, "surmount the dualism with which the essay has been content, and which, here in Matter and Memory, is conceived only as a critical procedure resulting in a provisional conclusion. The real conclusion is memory, or more precisely, duration, understood as a sort of monistic substance, where substance itself is not understood as something stable, but rather as unstable differentiations of spirit into matter. Bergson's psychology of the immediate data of consciousness, therefore, is nothing less than a springboard into ontology. It is an introduction to metaphysics, to the metaphysics that Matter and Memory presents. This metaphysics begins with the concept of the image.